And
Yes, you want to ask a question?
yeah, I was going to ask a question to
Cool.
the start and say, is the time for this an hour? Do you want us to sort of finish within an hour? I think there was an hour and 15 minutes allowed on the Zoom. What are the rules?
That's actually surely an excellent question. You know the difference between good question and excellent question?
Hmm.
Excellent question is the one that I even don't know an answer to one.
Okay.
So anyways, the seminar is about 40 to 45 minutes.
All right.
And
Okay.
then we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
Fine.
And then those who have to go will go, and we will stay, if it's fine with both of you, for an informal discussion for additional, as you said, about
Great.
15 minutes. And
Great.
now I will
Okay.
proceed with a very short introduction, and then the floor will be yours. So this is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Chris Starmer and Dr. Orestis Kopsacheilis. Professor Starmer is the head of the SEDEX Research Center. He has published great many top publications, including QJE and AER. On top of that, he managed to obtain more than £8 million in grants. Last but not least, he had managed to get such support as, say, quote, now I'm quoting from Peter, that don't underestimate your value and your research. Okay, now I have to confess, maybe my quote is not exactly a quote, but this was kind of the idea. Dr. Kopsacheilis is a promising young scientist who has already published in many journals. And now, guys, the floor is yours.
Great. Okay. So let me then thank you for the invitation and a nice introduction. And what we want to talk about in this is some work that was conducted under quite a big project. The project that we got quite a lot of those millions for, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council of the UK. And it ran for about 10 years from 2012. And it was an interdisciplinary project where the main participants in it were three behavioural research groups in the UK, the SEDEX group in Nottingham, the CBEST group associated with people like Bob Sugden and others at University of East Anglia, and the Decision Research Group at Warwick with a lot of very well-known people there. And the project was called Network for Integrated Behavioral Science, NIBS. And one of the things that we persuaded the ESRC we were going to try and do was to, at one end of it, work on trying to develop some basic science foundations of theory decision making and develop understanding of theories of decision making, both individual and strategic, and to also try and connect what we were thinking of some of the sort of interesting best behavioral science to useful applications in collaboration with organizations in government, third sector, private sector. So looking at things like sort of understanding household debt, blood donation, and so on. And there were multiple sub-themes in this project. And one of those themes was focusing on the role of experience in decision making. We're partly interested in that because it seemed to us there were some phenomenon that we knew about quite well, but in the process of trying to apply understanding of that, maybe one of the things that we didn't know enough about was the role of experience. And I'm going to talk about some of the work that was sort of in that sub-theme of the NIBS project, and in particular, studies that were looking at environments that involve some kind of learning or exploration of the environment through sequential sampling. And I want to talk about three projects. The three projects, one of those projects is that involved myself in the middle there. Oh, I should say Orestis put this slide together and rather nice of him. He picked a photograph of me that's about 20 years old now, so I look a bit more craggy than that. But one of the first project we'll talk about is this project that involved me, Orestis, and Robin and that's a paper on the description experience gap. Then work grew out of that within the project involving Orestis and two other at the time sort of more junior researchers, Denny van Dolder and Ozan Eisler, who were also associated with the project. The common theme of all of the researchers in these three projects is that at some point, we were all part of this NIBS project. So Orestis is also going to talk about this paper on a D gap, description experience gap, but in a social setting. And then I'm going to talk about some work that was conducted between me, Robin, and Jörg Weber, then a postdoc, investigating the phenomena of choice overload. If you want to access these papers, you can do it for two of them. One of them is published, the one on the left here. The work on the social DE gap, that's in development, currently under review, but latest version available on Orestis's webpage. The work that I'm going to talk about in the final section of this, this is work in progress, but there isn't yet a written version. We're working on it rapidly. Hopefully there's going to be a written version very soon, and when there is one, it'll be on my webpage that you can access there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Orestis for 20 minutes or so to talk about these two sort of projects here on the left. So I guess I should stop sharing and hand over to Orestis. And if I can just see. Okay.
Thanks, Chris. I don't know if everyone can see my screen currently.
I can.
Yep. Good. All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. So in the next 20 to 25 minutes or so, I will summarize findings from two papers on two types of description experience gaps. One in the context of individual decision under risk, where uncertainty is evolved by nature, and one in the context of social uncertainty, where uncertainty depends on the intentions of fellow humans. And as it turns out, at least at face value, the two types of gaps are markedly different. So I will conclude by offering an explanation that can reconcile these discrepancies. So yes, as Chris mentioned, by and large, experimental data have traditionally relied on decisions from description. So in the domain of risk and uncertainty, for example, the tradition from the standard rational model of expected utility theory to the more accurate descriptively and more behavioral model of prospect theory took place through a series of controlled laboratory experiments whereby participants were asked to make choices among different lotteries whose properties, outcomes, and probability distributions were fully described. And a key feature of this model was that low probability or rare events were overweighted. However, as I'm sure that regular attendants of this series already know, much of the decisions we make are not made under such descriptive knowledge of uncertainty, and instead we often rely to past experiences to inform our beliefs. And this could very well explain a wide range of empirical regularities, like, for example, why sub-Saharan farmers underinsure their land, seemingly underweighting or even ignoring the rare but possible occurrence of natural disasters. Approximately 20 years ago, a group of psychologists introduced an experimental framework in which decisions from description and experience can be systematically studied. Subjects in the description treatment make choices among fully described options. However, subjects in experience are left to infer those properties through a sequential sampling process. So in the paper, this paper, the next, and as well the paper that Chris will present, that type of exploration, that type of sampling is payoff inconsequential. Right? So in the sampling paradigm, as it's often referred, subjects click on each option and observe an outcome, which is coded to appear as frequently as its objective probability. So in this example, 4 will appear 80% of the time and 0, 20% of the time, while the second option will always return an outcome of 3. Right? So this is a sampling process with replacement, and the relative frequency, the experience relative frequency, if samples are large enough, eventually converges to the objective probability. When the subject feels that they have collected enough information, they stop and make a choice. And the canonical version of the description experience gap is that reveals a choice patterns, which is consistent with people in description making choices as if overweighting rare events, while in experience as if underweight them. And over these 20 years, it has been shown that the gap is robust. In a 2018 meta-analysis of 80 data sets, it was found that the gap is on average 10 percentage point wide in this measure, percentage overweighting, that is capturing the propensity to make choices that are consistent with overweight. Right. And among the key drivers, sampling bias stemming from collecting small samples in experience that tend to underrepresent the probability of the rare event has been proposed to be either very pivotal or even the single relevant driver of the gap. However, papers that have control for sampling bias also report description experience gaps that they attribute to several types of cognitive factors, such as the memory limitations that subjects in experience face because they have to recollect the sequence of outcomes, likelihood representation, which refers to the different formats in which information about probability is communicated descriptively and numerically in description, but sequentially and analogically in experience, as well as the preference-based account, namely attitudes towards ambiguity. And by ambiguity, we refer here to the residual uncertainty that subjects from experience face regarding the underlying probabilities, even if they have sampled even if they have collected large and representative samples. So the question that we address in this paper is by how much does its factor, by how much does this factor contribute to this gap? And a challenge in the literature, past literature, to infer an answer to this question is that the evidence for the gap was fragmented among markedly different experimental designs and often quantified under different measurement units, sometimes without a model through this propensity to make choices consistent with overweighting, or model-mediated accounts. And so in this paper, we introduce an experimental framework that tests in a single unified design for the operation of 4 distinct causal mechanisms that may drive the gap. And we quantify each factor through both model-mediated and through prospect theory and a model-free account. So here's how we do it. This is an overview of the experimental design. This is a 5-treatment design with 1 typical version of description and 4 variations of experience. To give you some further insight about how the versions of experience work, here is on the bottom of your screen, you can see the evaluation stage for the experience, which we refer to as unambiguous. So in the bottom of the screen, this is common for all treatments. This is a version of the bisection method by which people make increasingly higher in precision choices between the lottery that corresponded to the deck of cards that they sampled earlier on, and a safe amount of money until a certainty equivalent is elicited that makes people indifferent between this lottery and that safe amount. Now, our goal for the unambiguous treatment was to make it informationally equivalent to description. Thereby, comparing description with unambiguous, we would isolate the effect of presentation format. And to do that, we eliminate sampling bias by having people sample without replacement and having them sample the entire deck of cards. And in order to eliminate memory restrictions, we also present them with this history table that records the outcomes in the order that appear. And finally, to eliminate ambiguity, we tell subjects that this is exactly the process that they followed and that the entire deck of cards is now in display in front of them. In the no records treatment, we keep everything exactly the same, except that we remove that history table. And therefore, comparing the unambiguous treatment with no records, we isolate the effect of memory. The ambiguous treatment is exactly the same again as unambiguous, but this time we do not explicitly tell subjects that they saw the entire deck of cards, even though they did, preserving therefore that residual uncertainty about the underlying properties, about the probability distribution. And finally, the restricted treatment is exactly the same as the ambiguous treatment, but this time the sample size has been restricted to 18 cards instead of 40, introducing unavoidably some degree of sampling bias. Right? So the idea of the experimental design is to create these appropriate binary tests that isolate the effect of each of these four causal mechanisms. And as I mentioned before, we measure the gap both in a model-free way, but also in a model-mediated way. So through the 16 lotteries that every subject goes through, we parametrically estimate the utility curvature, and we use it in order to calculate decision weights for each subject across the probability unit interval. Right, so here are results for the model-free version. We see that, not surprisingly, the higher degree of overweighting appears for description. Now, if we take the average description experience gap, so the average difference between description and all our versions of experience, we find an average difference of approximately 9.5 percentage points, which is almost identical to this literature's average. Now, when we consider each effect in isolation, we find that the only statistically significant driver is that of sampling bias deriving from underrepresenting the low probability events. Factors such as ambiguity and likelihood representation are markedly smaller, but we see something interesting with respect to memory. When we see the model-mediated version of these effects, we can verify these earlier findings. The first thing that we notice here is that only in the presence of sampling bias under the underrepresentation form do we see an instance of objectively, not objectively, but like strictly underweighting of rare events, right? In all other instances of the gap, we find relative gaps whereby decisions from experience are also overweighting rare events, only less so than in description. The most interesting of those, or the most consequential in terms of their impact to the gap, is the factor of memory. That is when we are removing the history table. And the similarity of the no records treatment's weighting function with that of sampling bias begs the question whether we should be thinking of memory limitations as a type of sampling bias in the brain, something like a cognitive sampling bias. However, the open question that I would like to address in this remaining 10, 12 minutes or so is whether the type of conclusions that we drew when exploring the DE gap in individual uncertainty also hold when we consider it under social uncertainty, where the probabilities depend on other people's interactions. Now, this question has been relatively kind of underexplored in the literature. And one of the reasons why we think this was the case is because it is, from an experimental perspective. Oh, sorry. I see Ido having a question.
Just just short. One difference between your method and the method that we use and that show stronger description experience gap even in representative sample is that in our experiments, we get the effect when we don't tell them what are the pair of gambles. We don't tell them the gambles. We also, when we show them the gambles, we also found much weaker, and sometimes we don't get at all the pair of, the description experience gap. Something we call that the mere presentation effect. So your results are very elegant, but to compare them to our results, it would be important to consider the role of this mere presentation effect. Our point, yeah. Anyway, it's not a criticism. It's just to clarify the apparent difference between these two lines of research, two experimental paradigms.
Thank you, Ido. Yeah, that's a very good point, and something that we discussed. Indeed, as we mentioned earlier, part of the challenge in characterizing the partial contribution of its factor in the D gap is that there was a wide variety of different experimental designs and different elicitation processes across the studies. This is why we wanted to study these effects under a singular experimental design. So the mere presentation effect, that is, we tell subjects explicitly that there are two possible outcomes, right? This is common in every version of experience. And therefore, when comparing two versions of experience with each other, it's controlling for that effect. And then whatever remains is partially attributed to the unique feature that differs between those two treatments, right? Having said that, it's also interesting to see that even under the mere presentation, we can find strictly underweighting of rare events, such as when we have sampling bias. And also we find potentially weaker versions of the D gap in treatments that also control for sampling bias, right? So it is very likely that we would have, in absolute terms, find even bigger gaps if we were to hide the existence of a second outcome. But this is ultimately an empirical question. Thank you for this point. So going back to our attempt to transfer this kind of investigation under social uncertainty, I was saying that I think part of the reason why we haven't, the literature hasn't explored this question more frequently has to do with this inherently challenging task of controlling for other people's intentions when investigating how people respond for different levels of social uncertainty, for different levels of such probabilities. So our ambition in this project was to come up with an experimental design that allows us to exogenously manipulate probabilities of cooperation, in this case in a social dilemma, in the prisoner's dilemma game, but also manipulate the way in which this uncertainty is communicated through description or through experience. So I'm skipping through the introduction. Of course, cooperation in social dilemmas is important. And the leading explanation why people cooperate in these cases, even though not doing so is the selfishly maximizing pay of utility action, is that people are conditionally cooperative. They are willing to cooperate if they expect that others are going to do so as well. Conditional cooperation is experimentally typically investigated under information certainty, right? In a sequential prisoner's dilemma game, you're asked how you would behave if you knew that your match has chose to cooperate, and how would you behave if they chose to defect. And conditional cooperators cooperate if others did so as well and defect otherwise. However, in many everyday experiences, conditional cooperators are not sure about the intentions of their match, their partner, the people that, or the team they're about to cooperate. And in these cases, they essentially make decisions under uncertainty, under social uncertainty. And they are, of course, trying to elicit information that will help them find out how likely it is that this is going to be a mutual cooperative outcome. So our goal in this project is to manipulate exogenously the probability of cooperation and see how people cooperate in response to these changes, and to compare the patterns that emerge under social uncertainty with the patterns, stylized facts that we know about the gap in individual uncertainty. And we do that in the following experimental design. These are 3 stages. I'm going to talk about stage 1 and stage 2 here for the interest of time. In stage 1, all subjects make a one-shot prisoners play a one-shot prisoners dilemma game. The outcomes of this game are not known to them, but we use these actions for stage 2. There, we take stage 1 actions and form different groups with different cooperation rates, ranging from 0 to 100% cooperation. And we assign subjects to one of those groups. Using, however, the strategy method, we ask them to make a decision in each of these scenarios. And we communicate the probability of so by using the first stage actions, we make the probability of cooperation static, right? And then we communicate these probabilities of cooperation either through description or through one version of experience. So, for example, this is how the description treatment looks like for the group of 30% cooperation. In experience, on the other hand, we ask them to draw one by one the actions of this group, and they would observe 30% of the time a cooperative action and 70% of the time a non-cooperative action.
I have one question. I'm wondering, long time, the repeated games is always against the same opponent, or is it different?
Yes. So let me go back to the design. The game is not repeated. So the sampling, as I mentioned before, is non-consequential, right? So these are the actions that comprise of the first stage cooperation decisions. We take all these actions and form groups. Eventually, the subject will be matched with the person within the person's first stage action within the group that they were matched with. So there's no repeated play here. Everything is one shot. Does that cover your question, Peter?
I guess yes.
Yeah. Essential to that is that at no point do we give feedback on the outcome of that interaction. Right. And as I said, we also have a second version of experience that controls for sampling bias by asking people to sample just enough so that they see the objective probability. The relative frequency matches the objective probability. Okay, here are the results. The black line shows the cooperation rate for description, the gray line for experience. We observe a significant description experience gap, but it has 2 surprising features, at least surprising if anticipating the results from individual decision making. Here, we see that the experience response curve is higher than in the description when the cooperation rate is low. So when the cooperative event is rare, we see that people in experience, subject in experience, react more silently to it than subjects in description, and vice versa when the rare event is that of defection. The second surprising finding is that sampling bias, which is the leading explanation for the gap in individual decision-making, seems to play no role whatsoever in this social uncertainty. All right? So if we compare the 2 versions of experience, with and without sampling bias, we see virtually no difference. And this is not because subjects in experience with the free exploration sampled long and had representative samples. No, we see large signs of sampling bias, yet no effect in the cooperative rate as a response to that. To understand a bit better what's going on and what drives this discrepancy between description and experience, we disentangle the cooperation rates in 2 indexes, conditionality and cooperativeness. Cooperativeness more or less captures the overall propensity for people to cooperate across all scenarios, while conditionality measures the propensity to condition one's behavior in the changes of information. And we see that the treatment difference is not driven at all by overall cooperativeness. People are equally cooperative across treatments, but they are much more likely to condition their behavior in these changes of information in description than they are in experience. Okay, so this is the conclusion part. I promise that I will offer kind of an overarching explanation as to why we have these puzzling discrepancies between the individual and the social uncertainty. And our explanation, our hypothesis is that this is a story about the stickiness of priors. And namely, we conjecture that people's prior beliefs are stickier in the social rather than in the individual uncertainty, at least the way that this is typically implemented in an experimental laboratory. The idea here is that someone who is believing that the world is fundamentally cooperative might be less prone in the presence of ambiguity in experience to update down to 0 or to a very low percentage of cooperation rate if they sample and they see no cooperation, right? And they tend to maybe stick more to the prior, at least more so than someone who believes that, okay, maybe if I don't know the distribution of yellow and green cards, I think it's 50-50, but as I keep on sampling and I see no green cards, I will more sharply update towards the majority being yellow cards. We show in a simulation. Yes.
So in fact, you don't need the stickiness assumption. You just need to assume that the prior is different. As you said, maybe people just, the prior is above 50%, right?
But if the prior is entirely flexible, then having different priors wouldn't matter because they would very fast converge to the frequency, right? And this is, this is a very good observation. I'm gonna come to soon.
Thanks.
First of all, we see that under a behavioral model, stickier priors tend to produce flatter posteriors, which would explain why rare events appear to be more salient in experience compared to description. However, we also test that hypothesis in an ensuing study where we ask people to make a guess about the distribution of green and yellow cards in individual uncertainty treatment and about the distribution of cooperative or non-cooperative actions in a social dilemma. And there we observe that priors, this is back to your point, priors are not different across individual and social domain. They both guess that it's around 50%, right? And informative priors. But what is different is the confidence with which they make these estimates. And in the social domain, they're way more confident about their estimate than individual. I think it suggests that even if there's no good reason, people tend to have stickier priors in the social domain compared to the individual domain. Okay, so I'll leave the conclusion slide up there, and for the interest of time, I'll stop here. Happy to take questions now or at the end, depending on what you
just prefer. On the last slide, but do you have also the variance of the, it's not about the confidence, so maybe why people will be more, so you have to have a larger variance, and this is because you have a more bimodal kind of distribution. People are more confident that people are either cooperative or not, right?
Yes, that is a very perceptive observation. So although we don't see a difference in the mean, we do see a bigger difference in the variance. Yes.
Thanks.
I also have a remark. It is the prior is quite like description, and it goes a bit against the philosophy of people working in experience that prior should play a role. Well, there has been a paper by Ilke Aydogan, Management Science 2021, showing both mathematically and experimentally that the priors do play a role, and your finding also supports that.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, we discussed the paper by Ilke, and we agree with their findings. It's kind of this is the kind of story that we follow as well to explain that discrepancy. Thank you, Peter.
We are also, we understand prior is important, and maybe some simple model in the past ignore it, but our new models, we acknowledge that fact.
Moreover, the priors are very important when you have very few experiences. So when you look at sampling paradigm and you look at very few experiences, the priors may have a very large effect, I guess.
Yeah.
So the more experiences you have, the less
Yeah,
weight.
but our new results force us to acknowledge that even after 100 trial of experience, people are still affected by the priors. This is different than what at least my early models.
That's
So
a very interesting.
I agree that that your results make sense to me too. So they're not inconsistent with our recent findings.
I'll be looking forward to read your recent findings, Ido. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, well, should we, obviously we could come back if there's a bit of time left to talk about that, but should we switch over to,
Yes, let me try and stop sharing here. How? Wait. Oh, here we are.
okay. So let me. And can you see my screen now? Yep, you have my screen now? Yep. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about this project then with Robin and Yor, which is about choice overload, and a very quick bit of background. So there's fairly extensive literature exploring and claiming to find choice overload in behavior, roughly speaking, claiming that giving people more choice can sometimes reduce their welfare. And that's sort of surprising, at least at first blush, to economists who sort of claim more choice ought never to be bad for you. I suppose it's also counter to various forms of casual empiricism. You see sort of lots of organizations offering people massive amounts of choice like Amazon, and people seem to like it. Would they be doing that if it was bad for them? But there's a big literature on this dating back probably to work on information overload, maybe back to Buridan's Ass. But some of the prominent papers, I think, claiming to demonstrate choice overload are these, and work popularized by Barry Schwartz, Paradox of Choice. Our sort of motivation is the thought that while there's quite a bit of evidence claiming to show choice overload, we think that evidence is mixed and contentious. Some of the results have proved hard to replicate. Choice overload has been measured in different ways, and it's not always clear how to interpret the impact of overload in the way that it's being measured. So, for instance, sometimes measured as self-reports of satisfaction of choice. People may feel less satisfied, but are they actually doing less worse, let's say, in terms of satisfying their preferences in an environment? But also there's now various meta-analyses, and one conclusion you might draw from reading these meta-analyses is that the mean effect of overload looks to be around 0. I don't think the right reading of that is that there aren't any overload effects. I think the right reading of it is probably that there are overload effects, different causal mechanisms at work. So work needed to understand what causes overload and when, and that's sort of, so we're partly in this project trying to look for evidence that sort of convinces us that there's a genuine overload phenomenon that's sort of empirically relevant and impacting welfare in a significant way, and wanting to explore the causal factors. And the way that we approach this is looking for evidence of overload in what I'll call a sort of stylized shopping environment. We've got in our minds things like sort of problem a consumer faces, say, when they're thinking about a significant purchase, say, new consumer durables, something like an energy contract. What we're thinking of generically are choices of products in a multi-attribute product space where there's potentially lots of products that you could choose from. The consumer to begin with doesn't know exactly what the product space is and has to do some work to identify what they think is the best product for them. So that's the sort of generic kind of environment we have in mind. And within such an environment, we're trying to then manipulate what we think might be potential causal factors implicated in choice overload. And amongst those are what's the nature of the goods or the projects, and who's controlling the number of products that could be considered, whether it's the decision maker themselves or some sort of external choice architect. And we're going to, in our environment, in the spirit of the description experience gap work, we're also trying to use multiple measures of overload to map into what previous people have done, but with a key feature of our design that we want to have a measure of overload that can be interpreted in terms of preference satisfaction. So that's one of our objectives. So our setup is going to involve a large set, call this a grand set, of multi-attribute objects, placeholders for products, but these objects are going to have attribute values that are initially hidden but can be searched, and then the agent's job is roughly to pick one of these objects, search around and pick one of the objects, and that's going to happen through 3 time-limited stages. First off, the agent is going to acquire a shortlist from this background grand set. They then have the opportunity to discover through search attribute values. They then pick one, and they're going to get repeated experience of this environment. And I'm going to show you on the next screen a speeded up demo, just to give you a feel for what this environment looks like to the subject. It is speeded up, but what you're going to see in the first step of this is a feature of a particular treatment, not across all of the treatments, but as the first step, they're asked, how many objects do you want to see? And then when they give an answer to that, they see the set of the number of objects that they requested. What these objects are going to be in this environment, not all of the environments, but in this environment, are lotteries with money payoffs that would be determined by the roll of a 6-sided die. So here comes the speeded up demo. So first off, you're being asked, how many lotteries do you want to inspect? This candidate said 9, please. And then now these rows are lotteries with hidden payoffs where they're going around revealing the payoffs, and the remove button is allowing saying, oh no, I don't like that one, don't like that one, not interested in that. They've now got a choice between 4 that are left here, and they've got to pick one in the remaining time. They're picked one, and they're then being shown the faces that were unrevealed on the thing that they picked. So there it's going again. That's what's happening. It's just a sort of rerun of the same thing. Very fast and speeded up. And you can see these sort of lotteries. So that's roughly the environment. Now, I want to, sort of time permit, show the results from 2 studies. The first study is what this demo comes from, and it has the feature that the subject themselves decides on the shortlist, the size of the shortlist that they want. In study 2, the experimenter is going to exogenously fix the shortlist size. But in both of these environments, they're meant to capture a sort of trade-off between, on the one hand, if you've got a bigger shortlist, it's more likely to contain good things populated at random from this grand set. On the other hand, the bigger it is, the more difficult it is for you to search, and maybe that hinders your search. So in the first study, it's essentially a 2x2 design where we vary the nature of objects. In one treatment, they're lotteries, and in the other treatment, they're fixed value objects. Say more about that in a moment. We also vary time pressure. I'm going to sort of skip over the details of that, though. Now, in any round of this shopping, the individual shortlist gets populated from a background grand set of 1,000 objects. So there's a lot of objects. And it's the same grand set for the fixed value objects and the lotteries. The only difference being is that when the objects are lotteries, the final outcome, if you hold one of these things, is determined by the roll of a die, whereas if they're fixed value objects, the payoff to the agent from holding one of these things is the average of the 6 payoffs. So they're not lotteries, you just get paid fixed value, the average, and some indication there of how much these were worth to people. Best payoff was £40, average value of the objects was £9. Now, our main performance criterion that we're interested in is the rank that's achieved in the grand set. How far up this list of 1,000 objects do they manage to climb? Now, for the fixed value objects that aren't lotteries, they can be ranked objectively according to the average value of the payoffs from the object. On the other hand, if they're lotteries, then the rank of them for each individual, that depends in general on their risk preferences. So we might expect different rankings depending on the individual's risk preferences. And so what we do in this case is that we have separate tasks to elicit the individual risk preferences. I'm not going to have time to go into the details of this, but it's important to say that we measure the risk preferences before the shopping tasks, and we measure them in a context where we're not expecting the agents to be overload. We use simple tasks, so effectively choices between pairs of lotteries. The outcomes aren't hidden, so there's no searching to do, and there's no time pressure. And we essentially use an off-the-shelf method to impute to each individual a prospect theory preference model, and it's based on the method of Abdullahi et al. From JRU, adapted to our circumstances, but essentially based on their method. So let me quickly skip to show you what happens in the environment where individuals choose their own shortlist sizes. On the left here is the low pressure environment, on the right the high time pressure. I'm just going to zoom in on the high time pressure environment, but you see a similar thing in both environments. You see this hump shape, shortlist size that they're picked along the horizontal, how far they've climbed up the grand set ranking on the vertical. The red line here would correspond with the average payoff if people picked at random. And you can see here this hump shape. We've here fitted a quadratic function to the data to give us this hump shape. And that's consistent with choice overload and the idea that you've got to pick a big enough shortlist size to allow you to access good things. But beyond a certain shortlist size, once you start to go down the right-hand side of this hump, bigger shortlist sizes you're doing worse with. So we thought this was consistent with what people have been finding in earlier literature, consistent with choice overload, but not yet, we thought, sort of conclusive evidence of a causal effect of shortlist size on performance, at least partly because of the endogeneity here of the shortlist size. It could be, for instance, that there's a distribution of choosers in terms of how good they are at this search activity, and it could just be that people who are not very good at it, perhaps they tend to pick bigger shortlist sizes, so the causality is a bit muddy here. So that partly motivates the second study, where we fix shortlist sizes. And we pick shortlists, 4 different shortlist sizes in this experiment, 9, 14, 23, and 52 objects. And that corresponds with, so you can think of this as sort of shortlist size 9, that's a bit left of hump, shortlist size 14, a bit right of hump, shortlist size 23, that's the biggest shortlist that anybody ever picked in this setup. Shortlist size 52, double that, it's off the scale of what people ordinarily pick. So we set shortlists at those different sizes. We look only at the high time pressure environment in this second experiment. Each individual faces each shortlist size 4 times in 4 blocks, so 16 tasks in all. And then there's a between subjects manipulation. They either get the lottery environment or the fixed value environment. For both sets of subjects, we measure their risk preferences. We only need them for the lottery treatment, but we measure the risk preferences in exactly the same way. So then I'm going to show you sort of key result for what we see. But just before I show you that result, I just want to make this comment on optimal search. Or sort of one side of the comment is we don't know what constitutes optimal search in this environment. We think it's sort of difficult. We don't know how to identify optimal search, but we can easily identify a property of optimal search, and that is that there would be search processes which would guarantee that average performance when you're confronting a shortlist size greater than 9 should be no worse than it is when the shortlist size is 9. And so, for instance, an example of that would be if you just consider the first 9 options, don't pay any attention at all to more options, then you ought to do at least as well as you can do when you've actually got 9. So we then think, were you to find that performance were decaying with shortlist size, that would be evidence of suboptimal search, and we think evidence of a choice overload phenomenon. So here's what we see. We've got performance at shortlist size 9 rising through to 52. Again, the benchmark of random choice around 500. What happens in the lottery environment? Well, this is when when we're assessing the agent's performance using their ranking based on their prospect theory preferences we've imputed to them. And you can see that for shortlist size 9, they're managing to get up to just below 800 in this ranking. As we increase the shortlist size, the performance is coming down until by the time we're giving them a shortlist of 52, they're barely doing better than random performance. As a bit of a sanity check, we can show you what happens if we instead just assume that their expected value maximizers, so risk neutral. Well, the data looks a bit different, but we see the same key underlying pattern. Don't want to spend too much time thinking about the difference between those, but then if we look at the environment in which they're choosing amongst these certain objectives, the row average objects, then again you see a similar downward decline here. We also measured their choice satisfaction. We measured this for each subject for the final block that they chose, and we see downward decay in choice satisfaction. So that's mapping into another way in which choice overload has been measured. So we're interpreting this as evidence of suboptimal search behavior emerging as we impose higher shortlists on people. So a couple of quick remarks on what is it that's going wrong, and do people differ in their overload proneness? And we do some structural modeling to explore this. Haven't got time to tell you really any details of the models, but effectively we construct a model of search behavior. And what we find there is that effectively people are drawn into considering a wider shortlist as a consequence, or a wider range of considered options on their shortlist. So they're opening cells associated with a larger number of alternatives as the shortlist size increases. But as a consequence of that, they're getting more sparse information on the objects that they're considering. They're also spending less time thinking and more time opening. So we think that sort of sparsity of information and the thinking time, reduced thinking time, is partly what's leading to the reduction in performance. if we ask, do people differ in their overload proneness? Well, we actually measure lots of individual characteristics, risk attitudes, ambiguity sensitivity, we measure CRT, we measure impulsiveness, and we find one individual level characteristic which seems to have a kind of a consistent effect on behavior. So consistent, by that one sense of consistency is that we see it in both the lottery and the non-lottery environment. The one effect is from the characteristic of measured impulsiveness. So the degree of impulsiveness of an individual affects their performance. I'm just ask you to think for a moment, would you think that impulsiveness would mean people get on less well or better when they're facing a sort of complicated environment? Our data suggests impulsiveness is good for you in our environment. So I think there's lots of evidence that impulsiveness can be bad for you, relatively limited evidence that impulsiveness can be good for you. Our environment is showing us that impulsiveness is good for you because it seems like these characters are not being drawn into this more extensive search as a consequence of being offered more choice. So I'll stop there while we've still got a few moments of the hour still left to go.
Thank you. This is very interesting. And now I open the floor indeed for a few questions. So Ido, you have a question?
No, maybe James first. I already talked. Let James start.
Oh, okay. So James, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting talk. I think I missed something because it seemed to me that you were using two types of stimuli. Some were lotteries and some were single values, and
That's
yet
right.
I didn't notice the results being graphed separately for those two. Did I miss a slide?
Yeah, I'm afraid I was shooting through things really, really fast. So in here, really, if you look at these sort of yellowish diamonds, that's the lottery or risky choice environment, and performance measured by imputing to each individual a sort of prospect theory parameters. The EV is the same environment, but just assuming the agents are risk neutral. So, and then the row average, that's the certain environment.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you. That's clarifying. The other question was, you mentioned quickly a result in which you seem to have established that with larger choice sets, somehow a strategy in which they only look at the first 9 could be shown to be adequate, or and I didn't quite follow the logic of that.
So the thought there was, what's optimal search in the environment? Could it be that what we're observing is the consequence of an optimal search strategy that we just haven't properly modeled? And we're claiming that it couldn't be that this downward sloping pattern here is a consequence of optimal search. The reason for that is that suppose that this is the first column is capturing what you're able to do when you've got 9 objects. So now suppose you've got 14 objects. You ought to be able to do at least as well in this 14 environment as you do in the 9 environment by only considering 9 objects, because under those circumstances, effectively, the 9 environment becomes equivalent to the 14 environment through the heuristic of just searching across 9 objects.
Because they're randomly chosen or represented.
They are randomly chosen, exactly.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Ido.
Yeah. Peter did not allow us to say that it was a nice talk, so I can only say that 24 years ago, when I started talking about this issue with Sheena Iyengar, I tried to think about the different models like that or different analysis like that, and I couldn't do it. So for 24 years, I was waiting for this idea, but you already presented it.
Oh, bless you. Thank you.
This is really nice connection between the two lines of research. This is really, really fun.
Great, great. I'm glad you like it. We're hoping.
I don't like it. I want to do it myself. You know, it was almost there. Give me another 24 years, maybe I would get it. Very nice.
Well, maybe I can send you the paper when we have it. I'm meeting with the co-authors tomorrow,
definitely
and
it's
we're
a really nice paper.
After a long, slow process, we're starting, I think, to get a version of it that we're ready to share. So that'll be ready soon. Patrick, were you waiting for the question?
Yes, yeah, fascinating talk. So a lot of stuff to think about. But I wanted maybe to go back to Orestis about. I was trying to figure out what are the reasons why description affects conditionality and not cooperativeness. So can you give us any clue about that?
Yes. It seems to me so. Since the assignment to treatments was random, it would be peculiar to expect that for some reason experience or description elicits different levels of cooperativeness. What seems to be the case instead is that conditional cooperators have an internal switching point after which, after a certain critical mass of the group cooperates, they are willing to cooperate as well. But it is harder to exactly pinpoint what that switching threshold is in experience. If I could share my slides again, I can show you what I mean. So if we look at the point in which the jump takes place. So here you can see that when people in description find out that at least half of their group is cooperating, they jump and they switch behavior from not cooperating to cooperating. While in experience, that threshold is kind of missed. They don't exactly know when that 50% is. So partly what the story there is that there is some degree by which people in experience cannot discern the underlying likelihoods as sharply as people in description do. So this is how the difference in conditionality, we think, comes from.
So something like a threshold effect somehow.
I think maybe maybe the threshold is in both cases around 50%, but it is not easily discernible in their experience where that 50 is. Is it at 30? Is it at 70? They look very similar to each other.
Okay, thanks. Fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. Unfortunately, the time is running up and we are even out of time. So I want to thank you for this very interesting, thought-provoking talks. And those who have to go now can go, but we will have the opportunity to stay for a few more minutes for the informal discussion part. So again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for coming.
Okay, so now those who have additional comments or questions, this is the time.
Maybe just as a follow-up comment on Patrick's question, another reason why we think that conditionality is significantly higher in description would also go back to the strength of priors. To the extent that someone has a very strong prior about the likelihood of cooperation, they will be less prone to change their behavior under the light of new information. Therefore, the conditionality would be closer to zero, right? They wouldn't change their cooperative behavior in light of different levels of cooperation rate. This would also explain why we find no effect on sampling bias, right? To the extent that you disregard new information, why would it matter if that new information is biased, it's incomplete, right? So that's just to, yeah.
And I wonder if I could just follow up on what you were saying, Ido. And I wondered if I could ask you perhaps just to maybe say again and maybe elaborate a little on what it was you were sort of thinking that we've done here that you would like to have done. And for some reason your audio feed is a little less loud than some of the others, so maybe you could sort of speak up for my benefit just a little bit. Oh, but also
No, now you're muted. 1 second, everyone muted.
Yeah, great.
Oh.
Yeah, no, for a long time ago, I thought that the mixed results in Iyengar's research are results of some things that might be related to sampling, but I didn't get to such an elegant. It's a really simple idea that you present, and this I think it may help solve this debate in the literature that now is continuing now for 25 years. And this is a really simple and convenient explanation. And probably if you go back now for all the studies that could get it and could not get it, maybe you find that it's, of course, what you could do if you want to, in a follow-up research, to go back to this literature and show that you can explain that situations that are more similar to your task. This is a situation when you got it, like with her JAM studies, and situations that are more, I've recently reviewed a paper that was internet shopping that couldn't find it, and probably because in the internet you don't do much sampling. So I would go back to this literature. This is, of course, you should publish this paper. This is a paper that could publish in a top journal that like short papers. And then maybe another meta-analysis that use your method to test the hypothesis of your method, that when you get it and when you don't get it in natural settings.
That's a good thought. And one of the sort of motivations for the setup that I didn't really go into this, but part of what motivated our switch between the lotteries and the fixed value objects was the suggestion we'd seen in the literature that overload might be more severe when it involves a preferential choice where you have to kind of consult your preferences, so to speak, because a number of the studies, they effectively have kind of calculation tasks, which are sort of analogues of our fixed value environment. And so we wanted a controlled test between a preferential choice and where it's simply a sort of calculation to be done.
Yes.
What we see is a little bit of evidence that there is a stronger effect for the risky environment as you move from the small choice list to one that's a bit bigger, but then they come together again after that. But we wonder whether it might be a ceiling effect in that the performance is so bad by the time you get up to 52, everything's collapsed more or less to random behavior. And so we think we've got a bit of evidence that one of the causal mechanisms is this, or a difference between, if you like, subjective and objective rankings.
Yeah, but this will be interesting. But this is my attempt to imitate Amos Tversky. If you want to publish it in a top journal and get a lot of attention, then I would just keep the average condition. The other condition just, and the prospect theory, sorry, Peter left, so I can say whatever I want. The other condition will not help you out if you want to publish in a journal like Nature Human Behavior or Nature. I think that, the simplest, you get it in the average. This is such a simple settings. Why do you need all this other, the other solution could be follow-up research, but if you want people to understand what you're saying, go for the simplest one. Maybe, again, if it was Amos Tversky, and it's not, of course you have to be able to write like Amos, I would only go with experiment 2 condition average.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And put all the rest in appendix or something.
Well, that's something to think about. I'd never.
Yeah, I do not guarantee publication, but for me that your idea is so simple. Then
That's a very interesting thought, Ida, and I'm meeting with my co-authors tomorrow, and I'm going to raise that thought with them. That's
if I was a reviewer, this is what I would suggest. It was one condition that show your story.
Yeah, no, I think it seems to me, if that did work, beauty of it would be, I think there's a paper in the comparison of the objective and subjective ranking. It's a more complicated story, but it seems to me it's a sort of an interesting question, because people have speculated about the fact, is having to consult is that part of the problem? And we've got a direct test of it, and I think a very controlled test of it, in the sense that these environments are isomorphic, apart from the switch from risk to row average. So I sort of like that element of the story. But if it was the case that conveying that element of the story undermines another main take home, or perhaps the main take home, then it's worth thinking about. I'll definitely try that.
But if I want to give you, but another, maybe one reviewer said, but you should also show us when you get the opposite effect. This will be easy to do, of course, if you change the perf distribution. If one, obviously, if one option give you all high perf and all the rest give you low perf, depending to the individual, of course, seeing more will be better. So maybe you need maybe thought experiments will be enough for that.
Yeah.
But some reviewers do not understand thought experiments, so.
Yeah.
Patrick, I see you raise your hand.
Yes, I guess that's a question for Chris. So sorry to be slow again, but I was trying to make sense of, probably I missed the part where you explain how you aggregate all these multi-attributes, if we think in terms of preference.
So in some sense, it's sort of the individuals who are doing the aggregating. So the objects they've simply got 6 money payoffs, and so for the certain objects, the value to them is simply the average of those 6 payoffs. For the individuals who are facing the lottery treatment, for them, it's a if they hold one of these objects, it's a uniform lottery over the 6 payoffs. So then there's a question, how do those individuals rank these 1,000 lotteries? To answer that question, we impute to them a prospect theory function, which has got curvature of utility, essentially 6 decision weights, one for each of probability 1/6, probability 2/6, and so on. So we then use that to rank these objects and have a sort of person-specific ranking of the objects. So is that answering your question? How do we do the aggregation?
Yeah, exactly. And so in a sense, you are being a little bit conservative, right? Because if I understand you correctly, there's some monetary aggregation in the process, which somehow must be reducing the choice overload in comparison to a world in which, you know, people would have to somehow compare the attributes which are, you know, high-dimensional objects. Right.
No, that's right. In a certain respect, no, I see what you're saying. So in a certain respect, it's still quite a simple problem that the agents have got in terms of well, conditional on, you know, it being meaningful to think that an individual has a sort of an attitude to risk that can be encapsulated in a prospect theory model. So obviously, in a certain sense, that's a sort of big assumption. But on the assumption that an individual, in some sense, has an attitude towards risk, then that's the only thing, in some sense, that they've got to bring to bear to evaluate these objects. Whereas you think about something like a choice of cars, then, you know, they've got to think about trading off cost against comfort and performance and so on and so forth. There's these multiple dimensions. And so you might say, well, you know, to the extent that applying your preferences, making trade-offs is something that contributes to the overload or a causal factor in the overload problem. You might think we're looking for it. We've got quite a sort of weak stimulus in that sense that we're using.
Yeah, but still that's nice, because even in this environment, you still find some choice overload anyway.
Yeah, we do. No, we think we've got, you know, incredibly strong evidence of overload, really.
Okay, guys, this was very interesting, and I want to thank you, Orestis and Chris. And unfortunately, we have to wrap up now because time is running.
Pleasure. Thank you for the invite.
It was really fun. It was really nice research. All three papers.
Yes, very interesting.
Thank you for the invite and for the useful comments.
Yes, indeed. Very useful.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.